What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. This time we're going to be going over the Magicka Templar DPS. This particular build is a ranged build, so we're going to be making use of the new Asylum staff that drops from the new trial in Clockwork City. With this new staff, being ranged as a Magicka Templar DPS has become a lot more viable. You will pull anywhere from about the same numbers to slightly lower numbers depending on how well your rotation is put together, but having a third option for Magicka DPS that is also ranged is a very good option. It adds a little bit more diversity now to the Magplar options in terms of builds. Like our other build videos, we're going to be going over gear, skills, and our CP point distribution, and finish things off with a Parse on a 3 million dummy. Go ahead and start with our gear. I'm going to be using 2-piece Lambrisp. I have one health enchant on my Lambris head. That's because I'm going to be using Witch Mother's Potent Brew. Magplars do have a small sustain issues if they're running the traditional melee Magplar, but because we're using Force Pulse as a ranged Magplar, that sustain problem becomes a lot larger. It becomes fairly comparable to Sorc sustain issues, so we're going to be using Witch Mothers to kind of offset that. But of course, the downside of using Witch Mothers is you lose health and Magicka, so we're going to be using a health glyph to make up for that loss in health. Our 5-piece is going to be Giuliano. Since it is crafted, I highly recommend going with a heavy chest. That gives you a little bit more resistances compared to using like a heavy head or shoulders on your monster helm, for instance. And then the rest can be light. I'd have medium feet here in Giuliano's. Where you want to put your medium piece is really up to you. You have 4 options. You can have feet or legs, or you can do shoulder or head. So it really depends on whether you get lucky with your monster helms and get light divines or medium divines, whichever one comes first. If you're using one medium as your monster helm, just make these last 4 pieces of Giuliano's light. For our jewelry, we'll be using Moon Dancer. You can use Infallible Aether or Master Architect. Those also give you Minor Slayer as the 3-piece. Or alternatively, you can use 3-piece Willpower jewelry. Willpower does beat out Moon Dancer and Master Architect as well as IA. Moon Dancer and Master Architect are slightly higher than IA, but the DPS difference between all of those sets are minimal at best. The advantage of using Willpower is that you can buy that off guild traders, so do keep that in mind. Willpower is still a very powerful set to use, at least in this build. All 3 jewelry enchants have spell damage enchants. You can replace one of these with a regen glyph. You'll see a minimal loss of DPS if you do so. The added sustain really helps out because it is affected by your CP passives. For our front bar, we're going to be using the Asylum's Inferno staff. This is an imperfect staff. The perfect staff only comes if you do the new trial on Vet hard mode, which is basically you beat all 3 bosses together. As far as I know, nobody has managed to complete that yet on the live server. So we're just going to be using the imperfect staff because that's what the weapon that you will most likely be able to get, because this does drop from normal in all configurations. Have a shock damage enchant here, and it's going to be an infused. And for our back bar, we have the Maelstrom's Lightning Staff, Nirnhoned with a weapon damage enchant. You can use infused if you want, or sharpened. It's up to you. I've tested all 3, and I like Nirnhoned the best, particularly because you'll be heavy attacking on the Lightning Staff back bar, and that extra magic damage from Nirnhoned will offset the increase in your weapon damage enchant from an infused Lightning Staff. But again, it's kind of a pick your own. The DPS difference is pretty small. Infused is technically the best, but Nirnhoned and Sharpened are very good. It all depends on what your luck with VMA. For attribute points, you're going to be going 64 points into Magicka, and for our Mundus, we're going with the Apprentice. You can use the Lover instead. It all depends on your group debuff sets and what kind of penetration values you can see. You can go with either the Lover or put points into CP. If you put points into CP, you have a little bit more control over how much penetration you get, so I recommend just sticking with the Apprentice, and if you need to add more penetration, do that through CP and not through the Lever Mundus Stone. For our bars here, This is going to be on your Asylum staff bar. You have Crushing Shock. You can use Force Pulse, but Crushing Shock gives you a lot more group utility since it helps interrupt enemies. Reflective Light. Reflective Light does more damage than Vampire's Bane. If you go ahead and look at the tooltip here, you'll see that it does more damage overall over an equivalent period of time, as well as you have 2 direct damage hits. So Reflective Light does increase your DPS compared to Vampire's Bane. Plus it hits 3 enemies, so you have a little bit extra cleave damage there. Purifying Light. This is where your shield would be. You'd be using Harness Magicka or Dampen Magic, but since we're doing a Parse, we're going to be putting down Elemental Drain instead. We have Inner Light here, and we're going to be using Empowering Sweep as our ultimate here, instead of Shooting Star. So now, this is why we're going to be using Empowering Sweep. This is because of the Piercing Spear passive under the Adric Spear line. It increases your critical damage done, and your damage against blocking targets by 10%, while you have an Adric Spear ability slotted. Now, in a traditional Magplar build, you won't be using Crushing Shock or Force Pulse, so you'd be using Puncturing Sweeps instead, so that's where you would get that passive. But because we're using Force Pulse here, we're going to be going with Empowering Sweep to maintain that 10% extra critical damage, which does really help out. Unlike our traditional Magplar, where this could be Shooting Star or the Destro ulti to maintain Ancient Knowledge. That's the reason why we have this ultimate here, so we get that 10% extra critical damage. We're not going to be using this on enemies. This is not going to be our ultimate that we're going to be using. Alright, on back bar, this is the Maelstrom bar. Blazing Spear, Blockade of Storms, Radiant Oppression, Channeled Focus, Inner Light, and the Destruction Staff ultimate. This is the ultimate that we're going to be mainly using on boss fights and on trash pulls. Going over our CP points now, you have 230 points to put into greens, blues, and reds, 230 for each. I have 75 in Tenacity, 75 in Arcanist, 26 in Warlord, 26 in Tumbling, and 28 in Shadow Ward. You can divide, so the most important thing is to get 75 in Arcanist, 75 in Tenacity. The other 80 points can be put in those other 3 nodes, however you'd like, and that's just to save stamina for when you do need to block cast or use Break Free in Trials. Now, this is where your CP distribution is going to vary. This particular CP distribution is optimized for my raid group, the raid groups that I run with, where we run with an Infused Torx Crusher and Power of the Light, but we don't have the tanks running Alkosh. So that's why I have a lot more points into Spell Erosion. So take a look at your group, what kind of debuffs you're running, and then make appropriate adjustments here and there based on what kind of penetration you're going to be seeing. So I have 34 in Elfborn, 49 in Elemental Expert, 38 in Spell Erosion, 34 in Mastered Arms, and 75 in Thaumaturge. Now, playing around with the blue CP points with the Spell Erosion, always want to have 75 in Thaumaturge for that Exploiter passive. It's still very powerful in this patch. And now for Spell Erosion, if you need to take points out of nodes to put them into Spell Erosion, take them out of Elfborn first and then Mastered Arms. Because Magicka DPS aren't running very high spell crit chance anymore, taking points out of Elfborn will have a less impact on your DPS compared to if you take it out of, say, Elemental Expert. If you need to put points out of Spell Erosion and into the other 3 nodes, Elemental Expert comes first, then Mastered Arms, and then Elfborn. For our red CPs, this is where, again, things can differ depending on the content you're running. This CP distribution is kind of a one-size-fits-most distribution. 48 in Ironclad, 1 in Spell Shield, 1 in Light Armor Focus, 34 Thickskin, 56 Hardy, 56 Elemental Defender, and 34 Bastion. Other pertinent things before we start our parse, we will be using Essence of Spell Power. Gives us Major Sorcery, Major Prophecy, and Major Intellect. Make sure to have Alchemy up to level 50, and make sure to get Medicinal Use all the way up to 3 out of 3. That way you will be able to maintain these 3 buffs basically for the entire fight, as long as you continue to use your potions as soon as they are available to you to use. So we're going to be going ahead with our 3 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of what the rotation looks like. Do keep in mind this is a 3 million dummy parse, so in an actual raid scenario, the fights are going to be going on longer. you're going to have a lot more buffs on you and debuffs on the enemy. So do keep that in mind when we go over our combat metrics parse. So any sustained problems you see here, they're going to be exacerbated more in an actual trial scenario just because the fights are going to be going on longer. That being said, you also get access to things like orbs and shards to maintain your sustain. You won't be casting elemental drain because your healers will be doing that for you. So all these caveats need to be kept in mind when we analyze this parse. So we're going to go ahead and start our parse in 3, 2, and 1. So there we go, that's our parse there, 34.7k. Gonna go quickly look at our combat metrics. So you guys can see here, regen versus drain. We have about a 300 Magicka loss per second on average. So that's why we're using Witch Mothers. We're kind of narrowing that gap because if we're going to use blue food, max health, max Magicka, not only do we lose the 319 magic, the magic regen, but it's actually going to be even larger just because the regen that you do get from Witch Mothers is boosted by Arcanist, that CP passive. I did not start using my J-Beam early enough. Normally, Radiant Destruction is going to be your #1 source of DPS, so do keep that in mind. On this parse, I kind of zoned out there and didn't execute when I should have. Generally speaking, you want to start your J-Beam at around 25% of the boss, and when you do that, you want to make sure to keep up your blockade. You don't necessarily need to keep up any other dots. Me personally, I just keep up Elemental Blockade and Shards while J-Beaming, as well as obviously you want to keep your channel focus up so you get that extra regen. So do keep that in mind. I did not execute appropriately on this parse and still managed to pull 34.7k. So that's it for this build video. Hope this helps, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.